12-year-old Jane Harper stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, fingers trembling as they traced the edge of her eye patch. The cruel whispers and stares at Westfield Middle School had left her confidence shattered, her hope slipping away. But Jane couldn't have known that her entire world was about to change. When Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson himself knocked on her door that evening, what he would say and do next would transform her life forever. Before we dive into this powerful story that will touch your heart, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this emotional journey, don't forget to subscribe. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets as Lewis Harper navigated the family car through the steady flow of traffic. In the back seat, 12-year-old Jane fidgeted nervously, her fingers constantly reaching up to touch the eye patch that covered her left eye. The atmosphere inside the car was thick with tension, as Jane's anxiety about her first day at the new school mounted with each passing minute. Her mother, Rebecca, sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at her daughter with a mixture of concern and encouragement in her eyes. "Mom," Jane's voice quivered slightly as she spoke, "what if the other kids make fun of my eye patch? What if they don't want to be friends with me?" Rebecca turned in her seat to face her daughter, her expression softening. "Honey, I know it's scary, but try to remember that everyone feels nervous on their first day at a new school. Your eye patch doesn't define you." Jane's fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack. "But it's not just the first day, Mom. Remember what happened at the last two schools? No one wanted to sit with me at lunch. Kids would whisper and point when they thought I couldn't see them. I tried so hard to make friends for an entire semester, but it never worked." Lewis glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern. "I know it's been tough, sweetheart, but this is a new school, a fresh start. Give it a chance, okay?" Jane nodded half-heartedly, her mind drifting back to happier times. "I miss my friends in Thailand. Everyone was so nice there. No one cared about my eye patch." Rebecca exchanged a look with Louis before turning back to Jane. "Sweetie, you have to remember that you were born and raised in Thailand for most of your life. It was familiar to you. The culture here in America is different, and it might take some time to adjust, but that doesn't mean you won't make friends here too." "Your mom's right," Louis added, "and sometimes having a few really good friends is better than trying to be friends with everyone. Quality over quantity, you know?" Jane sighed, looking out the window at the passing houses. "I guess it's just everything was easier in Thailand." Louis cleared his throat, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I know you miss it there, Jane, but you have to understand that things have been challenging since we moved back to the state. Finding good-paying work hasn't been easy, and the cost of living here is much higher, not to mention your medical—" Jane's fingers lightly grazed the edge of her eye patch, her voice barely above a whisper. Is there still enough money for my surgery next year?" Lewis's expression softened instantly. He leaned forward, resting a gentle hand on hers. "Of course, sweetheart," he said firmly, his tone brimming with reassurance. "We've been saving every penny, and I promise when the time comes you'll get the best care possible. Nothing's more important than that." "And after the surgery," Jane said softly, her voice tinged with a hopeful lilt, "can we visit my friends in Thailand?" Lewis gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his eyes flickering to the rearview mirror. The brief hesitation in his expression didn't escape Jane's notice, though he quickly masked it with a reassuring smile. We'll do our best to save up for a trip," he replied, his tone warm but measured. "It might take some time, but we'll make it happen." Jane's lips curved into a small, wistful smile as she gazed out the window. She wanted to believe him, but the unspoken weight in his words lingered in her heart like an unanswered question. As they approached the school entrance, Jane's anxiety peaked once more. The sight of other students streaming into the building made her shrink back in her seat. "What if the teachers don't like me?" she whispered. "What if the other kids are mean?" Rebecca reached back and squeezed Jane's knee. "Honey, look at me. Your dad and I will be right here in the parking lot all day. If anything happens, if you need us for any reason, we're just a phone call away, okay?" Jane took a deep breath, drawing strength from her mother's words. She nodded, straightening her shoulders as Louis pulled up to the drop-off area. "You've got this, kiddo," Louis said, giving her an encouraging smile. "Remember, you're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think." With one last deep breath, Jane opened the car door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. As she walked towards the school entrance, she could feel her parents' eyes on her back, a comforting presence that gave her the courage to take each step forward. As Jane disappeared into the school building, Louis and Rebecca remained in the car, both lost in their own thoughts. The steady stream of arriving students continued, and Louis found himself scrutinizing each interaction, searching for any signs of bullying or unkindness. "I don't see anything worrying," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "Everyone seems normal." Rebecca nodded, her eyes still fixed on the school entrance. "That's good, but it's early yet. We should stay vigilant." Louis sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You know, I can't help but think about all the school changes we've put Jane through. 3 schools in 2 years since we came back to the States. It's a lot for any kid to handle, let alone one dealing with her medical issues." Rebecca's expression tightened. "Don't remind me. Those non-refundable building fees we lost, that money could have gone towards Jane's treatment and surgery." "Hey," Louis said gently, reaching over to take her hand. "We can't dwell on past decisions. We did what we thought was best at the time. The important thing now is finding the right environment for Jane." Rebecca squeezed his hand but didn't look convinced. "I just worry that we're not pushing her hard enough to adapt. Maybe she's experiencing culture shock, but at some point she needs to learn to navigate American school dynamics. We can't keep comparing everything to her experience in Thailand." Louis frowned slightly. "I think we need to give her time, and this school a chance. Pushing too hard might backfire." They fell into silence again, both watching the school entrance intently. After about 2 hours, the parking lot had emptied of all but a few cars. "We can't just sit here all day," Louis said, starting the engine. "There's a waterfront area nearby with a seafood market. We could wait there, get some fresh air, maybe grab an early lunch. We'll still be close enough if Jane needs us." Rebecca hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right, but let's make sure our phones are on full volume just in case." As they drove away from the school, both Louis and Rebecca found themselves lost in thought, hoping against hope that this new school would be the fresh start their daughter so desperately needed. The waterfront area bustled with activity as Louis and Rebecca arrived. The salty sea air mingled with the aroma of fresh seafood and spices from nearby food stalls. They wandered through the market, their worries about Jane temporarily pushed to the back of their minds as they took in the vibrant atmosphere. "Look at those grilled squid," Rebecca said, pointing to a display of glistening shellfish on ice. "Remember how much Jane loved them when we were in Thailand?" Louis smiled at the memory. "She'd beg for them every time we went out to eat. Maybe we could surprise her with some for dinner tonight." As they continued their stroll, they found themselves near a small brunch spot where several other parents seemed to be gathered. They decided to take a seat at an empty table, ordering coffee and oysters to pass the time. At a nearby table, a group of young mothers were engrossed in animated conversation. Despite trying not to eavesdrop, Louis and Rebecca couldn't help but overhear snippets of their discussion. "I'm telling you that school's Facebook page is out of control," one woman said, her voice carrying clearly. "People are sharing every little problem like it's some kind of achievement. It's exhausting. Why don't they just share real achievement, you know?" Another woman chimed in, "But sometimes that's the only way to get things done. Have you seen how slow the police and government are these days? Unless something goes viral, they barely lift a finger." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the conversation hitting a little too close to home. She leaned in to whisper to Louis, "Maybe we should go. I'm not sure I want to hear any more of this." Louis nodded, checking his watch. "It's almost the school lunchtime anyway. We should go back and observe." As they stood to leave, Rebecca's eyes fell on a food stall selling spicy grilled squid salad. "Oh, Jane would love those. Should we get her some for lunch?" Louis hesitated. "Lunch won't she be getting from school?" "Yes, but something extra on the first day won't hurt, right?" Rebecca countered. "I don't know, Rebecca. Bringing her special food might make her stand out even more. We want her to integrate, remember?" "But it might comfort her," Rebecca argued. "Something familiar on a stressful day." After a brief debate, Rebecca's maternal instincts won out. They purchased the salad and headed back towards the school. As they approached the cafeteria, another disagreement arose. Rebecca wanted to take the food directly to Jane, while Louis worried it might draw unwanted attention. "I'll just drop it off with the cafeteria staff," Rebecca said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I won't embarrass her. I promise I will be discreet. She won't even see me." Louis reluctantly agreed, waiting in the car while Rebecca entered the school. She found the cafeteria easily, handing the takeaway container to a friendly-looking lunch lady. "Could you make sure this gets to Jane Harper in 7th grade?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The lunch lady smiled warmly. "Of course, dear, I'll make sure she gets it." Before leaving, Rebecca took a moment to observe the cafeteria. It was clean and calm, with students chatting amiably at their tables. The sight eased some of her worries, and she returned to Louis with a slightly lighter heart. As they settled back into their vigil in the school parking lot, both parents hoped that the familiar taste of home would bring a smile to Jane's face during her first day at the new school. The shrill ring of the school bell pierced the afternoon air, signaling the end of the school day. Louis and Rebecca sat up straighter in their seats, eyes fixed on the school entrance as students began pouring out. They scanned the crowd anxiously, searching for Jane's familiar face. When she finally emerged, their hearts sank. Jane walked alone, her shoulders slumped and her gaze fixed on the ground. The hopeful, nervous energy she had exhibited that morning was gone, replaced by a palpable aura of dejection. As Jane climbed into the back seat, Rebecca turned to face her, a forced smile on her face. "Hey, sweetie, how was your first day?" Jane remained silent, her eyes downcast as she buckled her seatbelt. Louis tried next, his voice gentle. "Did you make any new friends? How were your classes?" Still, Jane said nothing. The silence in the car grew heavy as Louis navigated through the after-school traffic. Both parents exchanged worried glances, their earlier optimism evaporating with each passing moment. The drive home was tense and quiet. Jane stared out the window, lost in her own thoughts, while Louis and Rebecca tried to respect her silence despite their growing concern. As they pulled into their driveway, Jane was the first out of the car, rushing inside without a word. Once in the house, Rebecca couldn't contain her worry any longer. She followed Jane to the kitchen, where her daughter was getting a glass of water. "Honey," Rebecca said gently, her voice light with affection as she glanced at Jane. "How about the squid salad? Did you enjoy it at lunch? We were at the fish market earlier and saw some fresh squid. It reminded me of how much you loved it back in Bangkok." At the mention of the food, Jane's fragile composure gave way. Her face crumpled and tears spilled over, streaking her cheeks in silent torrents before transforming into gut-wrenching sobs. Her hand, trembling with emotion, failed to hold onto the glass she was holding. It slipped from her grip, shattering against the kitchen floor with a piercing crash that seemed to echo her breaking heart. Rebecca rushed forward, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling Jane into her arms. "It's okay, let it out. I'm here, we're here." Jane clung to her mother, her cries muffled against Rebecca's shoulder, her small frame shaking. Louis appeared at the doorway, his face etched with worry. He knelt to carefully collect the shards of glass, giving Rebecca a silent nod to continue comforting their daughter. "It's just so hard," Jane choked out, her words fractured by sobs. "I miss everything. I miss how it used to be." Rebecca held her tighter, stroking her hair. "I know, my love, I know. And we're going to get through this together, every step of the way." "No, you don't understand." Through her tears, Jane began to speak, her words coming out in broken gasps. It was awful. Mrs. Roselle, the homeroom teacher, she made fun of my eye patch." Rebecca and Louis exchanged shocked glances. "What do you mean, honey?" Rebecca asked, her voice trembling. Jane took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself as she spoke. "During class introductions, she made a joke about me. She said I looked like a pirate, and that pirates steal and kill people. Everyone laughed at me. They started calling me pirate. Rebecca's arms tightened around Jane as her words spilled out in sobs. She said what? Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. She called you a pirate in front of the class? That's completely unacceptable. Lewis's jaw tightened, his expression hardening with anger, but he stayed quiet, allowing Jane to continue. Jane sniffled, her words halting. It got worse after that. Everyone kept calling me Pirate Jane. I tried to laugh it off, but they wouldn't stop. And then, Jane sobbed, her voice breaking, there was this future dream job fun day. I didn't know about it, so I didn't have a costume. Rebecca nodded encouragingly, her heart breaking for her daughter. But there was this boy, his name's Roy. He came in dressed like a boxer, and the teacher said it was great to see someone dressed for success like his dad. But when I said I didn't have a costume, she said, "Oh, maybe you can be a pirate when you grow up." And everyone laughed again. Her voice broke and tears poured anew. Mrs. Roselle made me participate, Jane whispered. She said my eye patch was costume enough and made me be the bad person for Roy to practice beating up. Everyone laughed. It was humiliating. Rebecca's face twisted in a mix of heartbreak and rage. Jane, that's bullying. What she did is bullying, and it's not okay. Lewis's hands curled into tight fists, his knuckles white with restrained anger. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before speaking. Jane, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice low but filled with determination. That's not just wrong, it's completely unacceptable. No teacher has the right to treat you like that. Jane nodded, sniffling as she wiped at her cheeks with trembling hands. I couldn't take it, she admitted, her voice breaking. I ran out of the classroom crying. I spent the rest of lunch hiding in the principal's office. I never even got to eat the salad. As if suddenly remembering, Jane reached into her backpack and pulled out the now soggy container of squid salad. She opened it, the smell of cold seafood filling the kitchen. Despite its unappetizing appearance, Jane began to eat it hungrily, her tears mixing with the food. Rebecca moved to stop her, concerned about the food's safety after sitting out all day, but Louis gently held her back. They watched in silence as their daughter devoured the meal, a physical representation of the comfort she'd been denied all day. Louis stood up, his jaw clenched, pacing a few steps before running a hand through his hair. This Mrs. Roselle, what kind of teacher does that to a child? He muttered under his breath. His fury was barely contained, but he forced himself to stay calm for Jane's sake. That teacher humiliated you, Jane. She made you a target for the other kids. This isn't something we're letting slide. I'll be talking to the school first thing tomorrow. Jane shook her head, panic in her tear-filled eyes. No, Dad. If you say something, it'll just get worse. They'll tease me even more. Rebecca gently cupped Jane's face, looking into her daughter's eyes. Honey, standing up for what's right is never easy, but it's important. What Mrs. Roselle did was wrong, and we need to make sure she doesn't treat anyone else this way. After finishing her meal, Jane looked up at her parents. Her red, swollen eyes shimmered with a determination they hadn't seen before. I'm not going back, she said firmly, her voice unyielding. I'm not going back to that school with this eye patch. I can't, not again. Rebecca and Louis exchanged worried glances, momentarily stunned by the finality in her tone. Sweetheart, Rebecca began gently, choosing her words carefully. I know today was awful, but... No, Mum, Jane interrupted, her voice resolute. You don't understand. I can't face them again. I just won't. She pushed back her chair and stood, leaving the empty container on the table. I need to be alone, she murmured, her voice trembling as she turned and walked toward her room. Moments later, the soft click of her door closing punctuated the silence that settled over the dining room. Rebecca and Louis sat frozen for a moment, the weight of Jane's words pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Finally, Louis exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. This is beyond unacceptable, Rebecca said, her voice laced with anger. That teacher needs to be held accountable. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. He stood abruptly, her mind already spinning with thoughts on how to approach the school administration in the morning. Before she could say more, the sound of Lewis's phone vibrating on the counter broke the tension. Rebecca glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's from your office." Louis sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Of course it is," he muttered. "I'm sorry, darling, duty calls. I took a full day's leave today, but still... This..." He kissed Rebecca lightly on the temple. "I'll be in my office upstairs. We'll talk more about this later. For now, let's give Jane some time to rest, and you too. Don't overthink this. We'll figure it out together." With that, and a kiss on Rebecca's temple, he headed upstairs, leaving Rebecca alone with the remnants of dinner and her swirling thoughts. Rebecca watched Louis ascend the stairs, his phone pressed to his ear, already deep in conversation. The tension in the room was palpable, the echoes of Jane's tearful declaration still lingering in the air. She sighed, rubbing her temples as she sat back down at the table. Her heart ached for her daughter. Jane had always been so spirited, so full of life, but the events of the day had clearly taken a toll on her. Rebecca glanced toward the hallway where Jane's bedroom door was closed tightly, a barrier between her and the world that had hurt her. She thought back to the conversation she had overheard at the market earlier that day about the power of social media to effect change. With a sudden burst of determination, she walked over to the living room and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began to type, pouring out the details of Jane's medical condition and the horrific experience she had endured at school. She was careful to omit the names of the school and the teacher, focusing instead on the broader issue of bullying and the need for greater understanding and compassion. After attaching a recent photo of Jane, Rebecca hesitated for just a moment before clicking post. She closed her laptop with a sense of both relief and trepidation, unsure of what response, if any, her post might receive. Exhausted by the emotional toll of the day, Rebecca found herself drifting off to sleep on the couch. When she awoke, the clock on the wall showed 4 p.m. Rubbing her eyes, she reached for her laptop, curious to see if anyone had reacted to her post. As the screen flickered to life, Rebecca's eyes widened in shock. Her post had gone viral, accumulating 10,000s of likes, shares, and comments in just a few hours. The outpouring of support and empathy was overwhelming. Excited by this unexpected turn of events, Rebecca hurried to the backyard, where she could hear the faint sounds of Louis and Jane playing. She found them engaged in a game of bowling, Jane's laughter a welcome sound after the day's earlier distress. "You won't believe what's happened," Rebecca said breathlessly, holding out her laptop. "Look at this." Louis and Jane gathered around, their eyes growing wide as they took in the massive response to Rebecca's post. But it was a particular comment that caught their attention, causing Jane to let out a gasp of disbelief. There, among the thousands of responses, was a comment from none other than Dwayne Johnson. "If they want to bully her, they need to deal with me first." Jane's face lit up with joy. "The Rock, he commented on our post?" As they marveled at this unexpected turn of events, Rebecca's phone pinged with a notification. It was a direct message from Dwayne Johnson himself, requesting their address for an evening visit. Without hesitation, Rebecca shared their address, her heart racing with excitement. When she told Louis what she had done, however, his reaction was more cautious. "Are you sure that was wise?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "What if it's a fake account? Why would Dwayne Johnson care about our problem enough to come here in the evening?" The atmosphere in the room grew tense as Rebecca's excitement gave way to doubt. She frantically checked the profile again, reassuring herself that it was indeed the official account with the blue verification tick. Louis remained skeptical. "Even blue ticks can be faked these days," he warned, adding to the tension. "What if it really is him, Dad?" Jane asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "I mean, it's The Rock. Why would someone fake that?" Rebecca, still glued to her phone, chimed in. "I triple-checked his profile, Louis. It's real. The blue tick, the followers, the posts, all legit. But I get it. It does feel almost too good to be true." Louis sighed, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I hope you're right, sweetheart. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves, okay? Just in case." As uncertainty settled over the family, they could only wait and see what the evening would bring, hoping against hope that their brush with celebrity support was genuine and not an elaborate hoax. Rebecca paced nervously, clutching her phone as the minutes ticked by. Outside, the fading sun cast a warm glow over the backyard, where Jane and Louis had returned to their game, though their minds clearly weren't on bowling anymore. Every now and then, Jane would glance toward the street, her excitement barely contained, while Louis's furrowed brow betrayed his lingering doubts. The evening sun had just begun to dip below the horizon when the doorbell rang, sending a jolt of anticipation through the Harper household. Rebecca, who had been nervously stirring the pot of stew for dinner, froze in her tracks. Louis, who had been trying to distract Jane with a board game, looked up sharply. Jane's eyes widened, a mix of hope and disbelief dancing across her face. "I'll get it," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. She quickly washed her hands, dried them with the kitchen towel, and moved towards the door with tentative steps, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached for the doorknob, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever or whoever might be on the other side. The door swung open, and there, standing with his larger-than-life presence and trademark warm smile, was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Next to him was a single assistant, notably without the usual entourage or cameras. "Good evening, Mrs. Harper," Dwayne said, his voice soft despite his imposing figure. "I hope we're not disturbing your family time." For a moment, Rebecca stood frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile the global superstar with the man standing at her door. Finally, she found her words. "Mr. Johnson, please come in." As Dwayne and his assistant stepped into the modest Harper home, Louis and Jane appeared in the hallway. Jane's eyes were as wide as saucers, her mouth hanging open in awe. You actually came," Jane whispered, her voice barely a breath. She bounced on the spot, her excitement barely contained. Dwayne's smile widened as he knelt down to Jane's eye level. "Of course I did, Jane. When I heard about what happened to you, I knew I had to come and see you myself." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Rebecca felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This wasn't just a celebrity making a PR move. This was a genuinely compassionate human being reaching out to a child in need. We were just about to have dinner," Rebecca said, suddenly aware of the aroma of the meal she had been preparing. "Would you like to join us? It's nothing fancy, but—" "We'd be honored," Dwayne replied, his warmth putting everyone at ease, "if it's not too much trouble." As they moved to the dining room, the initial shock of Dwayne's arrival began to wear off, replaced by a surreal sense of normalcy. Jane, who had been so despondent earlier, was now animated, her eyes shining as she looked at her idol. Over dinner, Dwayne spoke directly to Jane, his focus entirely on her as he asked about her interests, her dreams, and yes, her struggles. He listened intently as Jane, growing more comfortable by the minute, opened up about her experiences. "Jane," Dwayne said, his voice serious but kind, "I want you to know that you're not alone. What happened to you at school today was not okay, and it's not your fault. Tomorrow, I promise you, things will be different." You're going to come to my school?" Jane asked, her voice a mix of hope and disbelief. Dwayne nodded with conviction. "I am, and I'm going to make sure that everyone understands that bullying from anyone, students or teachers, is not acceptable." He paused for a moment, his gaze softening as he looked down at Jane. "Honestly speaking, I think your eye patch is cool." A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Let me tell you a story." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Back in my day as a boxer, I once encountered an opponent who fought with only one eye. He didn't let that stop him. In fact, he was faster and more agile than most of the fighters I faced. He used his limitation to his advantage, and it made him unpredictable. He didn't need both eyes to show the world what he could do." Dwayne's eyes met Jane's with a knowing look. "What I'm saying is, you've got something special. Don't let anyone make you feel less because of it. It's just another part of who you are, and who you are is incredible." As the conversation continued, Dwayne turned his attention to Jane's medical needs. "Can you tell me more about your condition?" he asked gently. "Is it something that can be cured?" Louis and Rebecca exchanged glances before Louis spoke. "Jane was born prematurely," he explained. "She has a condition called retinal myodysplasia. It's a congenital condition that causes structural weakness in the retina. The eye patch is to protect her eye from further strain." Rebecca added, "She's been undergoing vision therapy to improve coordination between her eyes and strengthen the neural pathways for visual processing. We've been saving for surgical interventions to repair or stabilize the retina." Dwayne listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When they finished speaking, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "I'd like to help with Jane's medical treatment if you'll allow me." The Harpers were taken aback. "Mr. Johnson, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't possibly—" Louis began. "Please," Dwayne interrupted gently, "I want to do this, not for recognition or fame, but because it's the right thing to do. I have a special place in my heart for cases of child bullying, and I believe schools and governments need to take this issue more seriously." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and after a moment of stunned silence, the Harpers agreed to accept his help, overwhelmed by his generosity. Dwayne gestured for his assistant to write it down. As the evening wore on, the conversation flowed easily. Dwayne shared stories from his own life, including his experiences with bullying and how he overcame adversity. Jane hung on every word, her earlier despair replaced by a growing sense of hope and determination. When it was time for Dwayne to leave, he knelt once more to Jane's level. "Remember, Jane," he said, his voice firm but kind, "you are strong, you are brave, and you are not alone. Tomorrow we're going to show everyone at that school just how amazing you are." As the door closed behind Dwayne and his assistant, the Harper family stood in silence for a moment, still processing the extraordinary events of the evening. Jane was the first to speak, her voice filled with a newfound confidence. "Mom, Dad," she said, "I think I'm ready for school tomorrow after all." Louis and Rebecca exchanged glances, relief and hope shining in their eyes. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they knew that their daughter would face it with renewed strength, and with an unexpected but powerful ally by her side. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of the previous day. The Harper family car pulled into the school parking lot, the atmosphere inside electric with anticipation. Jane, who had been subdued and anxious yesterday, now practically buzzed with excitement. As Louis brought the car to a stop, Jane's eyes darted around the parking lot, searching for any sign of Dwayne Johnson. Her enthusiasm, however, quickly gave way to anxiety when she didn't immediately spot him. "Where is he?" Jane asked, her voice tinged with worry. "He promised he'd be here." Rebecca turned in her seat, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm sure he's on his way, honey. There might be traffic, or he could be meeting with the principal first. Don't worry." Despite her mother's words, Jane's confidence visibly deflated. As the school bell rang, signaling the start of classes, she hesitated before opening the car door. "You've got this, Jane," Louis encouraged. "Remember what Dwayne said last night. You're strong, you're brave, and you're not alone." With a deep breath, Jane nodded and stepped out of the car. As she walked towards the school entrance, her parents watched her go, a mixture of pride and concern etched on their faces. Once Jane had disappeared into the building, Rebecca pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "I'm checking my Facebook inbox," she explained to Louis. "The response to my post has been overwhelming." Indeed, as she scrolled through her notifications, Rebecca's eyes widened. "Over 20,000 comments and likes," she breathed. "I can't possibly respond to all of these." Louis squeezed her hand. "You've started something important, Rebecca. All these people are standing with Jane now." The flood of support strengthened Rebecca's resolve. She turned to Louis, a determined look in her eyes. "I'm going to speak to the principal," she declared. "This can't wait." Louis hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise? Maybe we should wait for Dwayne." Rebecca shook her head. "No, I need to do this now. Will you come with me?" Louis glanced at his phone, frowning slightly. "I've got an important business call coming in. You go ahead and I'll join you as soon as I can." With a nod, Rebecca stepped out of the car and marched towards the school, her head held high. The outpouring of support from strangers had bolstered her courage, reminding her that she wasn't just fighting for Jane, but for all children who face bullying. As she entered the school building, the bustling sounds of the morning routine surrounded her. Students hurried to their lockers, teachers conferred in the hallway, and the intercom crackled with announcements. Rebecca made her way to the administrative offices, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. "I'd like to speak with Principal Haraway," she told the receptionist, her voice steady despite her nerves. After a brief wait, Rebecca was ushered into the principal's office. Principal Haraway, a man in his late 50s with greying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stood to greet her. "Mrs. Harper," he said, gesturing to a chair, "what can I do for you this morning?" Rebecca took a seat, meeting the principal's gaze directly. "I'm here about what happened to my daughter Jane yesterday, the incident with Mrs. Roselle." Principal Haraway's expression shifted, a practiced mask of concern settling over his features. "Ah, yes, I was briefed on the situation. I assure you, Mrs. Harper, we take all reports of bullying very seriously." Before Rebecca could respond, Principal Haraway launched into what seemed like a well-rehearsed speech. "Our school has a comprehensive anti-bullying program in place. All our teachers, including Mrs. Roselle, undergo specific training before they're allowed to teach here. They're taught how to discipline students without resorting to bullying tactics and how to handle conflicts between students." Rebecca listened, her frustration growing with each word. When Principal Haraway paused for breath, she interjected, "With all due respect, Mr. Haraway, if your anti-bullying program is so comprehensive, how do you explain what happened to Jane yesterday?" The principal's smile tightened slightly. "Mrs. Harper, I believe we may be dealing with a misunderstanding here. First days can be stressful, and sometimes past traumas can color our perceptions of events. I'm sure Mrs. Roselle had no intention of—" "Intention," Rebecca interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "Mr. Haraway, my daughter was humiliated in front of her entire class. She was made to act as a punching bag for another student. How can that possibly be a misunderstanding?" Principal Haraway held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Now, Mrs. Harper, let's not overcomplicate things. I'm sure if we sit down with Mrs. Roselle and Jane, we can clear this all up." Rebecca was about to respond when a commotion outside the office caught their attention. The school secretary burst into the room, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Haraway," she gasped, "you won't believe who's just arrived at the school gates. It's Dwayne Johnson, the Rock." The principal's face paled visibly, his composure slipping for the first time since the meeting began. "Dwayne Johnson? Here? But why would he—" He broke off, his gaze snapping back to Rebecca, who couldn't suppress a small, triumphant smile. "I believe," she said calmly, standing up, "that Mr. Johnson is here to discuss the very issue we've been talking about. Shall we go greet him?" Without waiting for a response, Rebecca strode out of the office, leaving a stunned Principal Haraway scrambling to follow. As they hurried towards the school entrance, Rebecca felt a surge of hope. With Dwayne Johnson by their side, surely now the school would have to take Jane's situation seriously. The corridors were abuzz with excitement as word of the celebrity visitor spread like wildfire. Students and teachers alike pressed against windows and doorways, trying to catch a glimpse of the Hollywood star. As Rebecca and Principal Haraway reached the main entrance, they found Louis already there, standing beside the imposing figure of Dwayne Johnson. Dwayne's presence was magnetic, drawing all eyes to him. He stood tall and confident, his expression serious as he surveyed the school. When he spotted Rebecca, a warm smile broke across his face. "Mrs. Harper," he greeted her, before turning his attention to the principal. "And you must be Principal Haraway. I believe we have some important matters to discuss." Principal Haraway, visibly flustered, attempted to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Johnson, this is quite unexpected. Perhaps we could speak in my office." "With all due respect, Mr. Haraway," Dwayne interrupted, his voice firm but polite, "I'm here for Jane Harper, and I'd like to speak directly with the teacher responsible for bullying her yesterday." The principal's face reddened, Now, Mr. Johnson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Our school has a strict anti-bullying policy. A policy that failed Jane yesterday, Dwayne cut in. I'd like to see Mrs. Roselle now, please. Realizing he was fighting a losing battle, Principal Haraway nodded stiffly. Of course, this way, please. As they made their way through the crowded hallways, students whispered excitedly, phones out to capture the unexpected celebrity visit. Rebecca walked beside Dwayne, feeling a mix of gratitude and awe at the power of his presence. They reached Jane's classroom, and Principal Haraway knocked on the door. When Mrs. Roselle opened it, her eyes widened in shock at the sight of Dwayne Johnson towering over her. Mrs. Roselle, Dwayne said, his voice carrying clearly into the suddenly silent classroom, I'd like to have a word with you about Jane Harper. As Mrs. Roselle stammered a response, Jane's face lit up with surprise and elation. The rest of the class sat in stunned silence, unable to believe that a Hollywood superstar was standing in their classroom doorway. Dwayne's eyes found Jane, and he gave her a reassuring wink before turning back to Mrs. Roselle. I think it's time we had a serious discussion about bullying, don't you? The tension in the air was palpable, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. It was clear that this confrontation was about to change everything, not just for Jane, but for the entire school. As Dwayne Johnson stood in the doorway of Jane's classroom, the atmosphere crackled with tension and anticipation. Mrs. Roselle, visibly flustered, attempted to regain her composure. Mr. Johnson, she began, her voice quavering slightly, I'm not sure I understand what this is about. Our school has a strict policy against bullying, and I assure you... Dwayne held up a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. His expression was stern but not unkind as he addressed the teacher. Mrs. Roselle, I'm here because of what happened in this classroom yesterday. I'd like you to explain your actions regarding Jane Harper. Mrs. Roselle's eyes darted nervously between Dwayne, Principal Haraway, and the Harpers. I'm not sure what you mean. Yesterday was just a normal day of class activities. Rebecca, unable to contain herself any longer, stepped forward. A normal day? You made fun of my daughter's eye patch and forced her to be a punching bag for another student. The classroom erupted in whispers, students shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they watched the drama unfold. Jane sat at her desk, her face a mixture of embarrassment and hope as she watched Dwayne champion her cause. Principal Haraway, sensing the situation spiraling out of control, attempted to intervene. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. No, Dwayne said firmly. This happened in front of the entire class, and it needs to be addressed here and now. He turned back to Mrs. Roselle. I want to hear your side of the story. Mrs. Roselle straightened her shoulders, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Mr. Johnson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were simply doing a class exercise about future careers. It was all in good fun. Good fun, Dwayne repeated, his eyebrow raised. Making a child feel humiliated and scared is your idea of fun. As Mrs. Roselle stammered out another defense, Dwayne's eyes fell on something in the corner of the classroom. Is that a security camera? He asked, pointing to a small old device mounted near the ceiling. Principal Haraway nodded reluctantly. Yes, we have cameras in all classrooms for safety purposes. A small smile played at the corners of Dwayne's mouth. Excellent. Then we can easily review the footage from yesterday and see exactly what happened. The color drained from Mrs. Roselle's face at these words. She looked from Dwayne to the principal, then back to Dwayne before her shoulders slumped in defeat. I may have gone too far, she admitted quietly. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I thought I was just trying to make the lesson more engaging. Dwayne's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Intent doesn't negate impact, Mrs. Roselle. Your actions, regardless of your intentions, caused real harm to a student under your care. He turned to address the entire class. This is a teachable moment for all of us. Bullying, whether from students or teachers, is never acceptable. It's not funny, it's not harmless, and it's not something to be brushed aside or ignored. The students listened in rapt attention as Dwayne continued. Each of you has the power to stand up against bullying, to be kind, to be inclusive, and to speak out when you see someone being mistreated. That's what real strength is about. Turning back to Mrs. Roselle and Principal Haraway, Dwayne's voice took on a more serious tone. I expect there will be consequences for what happened yesterday, and measures put in place to ensure it doesn't happen again, not just for Jane but for all students. Principal Haraway nodded vigorously. Of course, Mr. Johnson. We'll be conducting a full review of our anti-bullying policies and training procedures. Mrs. Roselle will be placed on administrative leave pending a thorough investigation. As the adults continued their discussion, Jane caught Dwayne's eye. He gave her a warm smile and a subtle thumbs up, causing her to beam with newfound confidence. The confrontation in the classroom marked a turning point, not just for Jane, but for the entire school. As word spread about Dwayne Johnson's intervention, it became clear that this was more than just a celebrity visit. It was the start of a real change in how bullying was perceived and handled within the school community. As the initial shock of Dwayne Johnson's presence began to wear off, a new energy filled the classroom. Students sat up straighter in their seats, their eyes fixed on the Hollywood star who had unexpectedly become their teacher for the day. Dwayne, sensing the opportunity to turn this moment into something truly impactful, addressed Principal Haraway. Sir, with your permission, I'd like to use this time to have an open discussion with the students about bullying and respect. Principal Haraway, still somewhat flustered by the turn of events, nodded his agreement. Of course, Mr. Johnson, I think that would be most educational. With a nod of thanks, Dwayne turned to the class. Before we begin, I'd like to set up a little live stream, if that's all right. I think this is a conversation that could benefit a lot of people. After getting approval from the principal and ensuring the students' consent, Dwayne pulled out his phone and set up an Instagram live stream. Within minutes, thousands of viewers had tuned in to watch. A boy in boxing shorts and gloves stood up hesitantly, making his way to the front. As he approached, Dwayne's face lit up with recognition. "Wait a minute," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I've seen you somewhere before." He thought for a moment. Then it came to him. "Your dad wouldn't happen to be Mike the Crusher Thompson, would he?" Roy's eyes widened in surprise. "Yeah, that's my dad. You know him?" Dwayne laughed. "Know him? Your dad and I go way back. He's one of the toughest boxers I've ever met in the ring. And I hear you want to follow in his footsteps, huh?" Roy nodded enthusiastically, his earlier nervousness forgotten. "Yeah, I want to be just like him." "That's awesome, Roy," Dwayne said, his voice warm but taking on a more serious tone. "But you know, being a great boxer isn't just about being tough in the ring. It's about discipline, respect, and using your strength to help others, not hurt them." He turned to address the whole class. "You see, kids, boxing, like any martial art or combat sport, isn't about violence or bullying. It's about self-discipline, self-defense, and respect for your opponent. A true boxer never uses their skills to intimidate or harm others outside the ring." Dwayne placed a hand on Roy's shoulder. "Roy, your dad is a champion, not just because he's strong, but because he's kind and respectful outside the ring. That's what makes a true champion." Roy nodded solemnly, clearly taking Dwayne's words to heart. "Now," Dwayne continued, "let's talk about strength. Real strength isn't about how hard you can hit or how tough you look. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It's about being kind to others, especially those who might be different from you." He gestured towards Jane. "Jane here has shown incredible strength. Despite facing challenges and unkindness, she comes to school every day, ready to learn and make friends. That takes real courage." Jane blushed at the praise but sat up a little straighter in her seat. "Each of you has that same strength inside you," Dwayne said, his gaze sweeping across the classroom. "The strength to be kind, to include others, to stand up against bullying when you see it happening." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now I want to hear from you. What are some ways you think we can make this classroom, this school, a place where everyone feels welcome and respected?" Hands shot up around the room as students eagerly shared their ideas. Dwayne listened attentively to each suggestion, offering encouragement and building on their thoughts. As the discussion continued, Dwayne touched on broader themes. Remember, your worth isn't determined by how you look, how much money your family has, or even how well you do in school. Each of you is valuable and deserving of respect simply because you're you. We all come from different backgrounds, have different experiences. That diversity is what makes our communities rich and interesting. Embrace those differences, learn from each other. Throughout the impromptu lesson, Dwayne's warmth and sincerity shone through. He shared personal anecdotes about his own experiences with bullying and how he overcame adversity, connecting with the students on a deep level. As the class time drew to a close, Dwayne addressed the Instagram audience as well as the students in the room. Remember, kindness is cool. Standing up for others is cool. Being yourself unapologetically is cool. Let's all commit to making our schools and communities places where everyone feels valued and respected. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but none of the students moved. They sat in rapt attention, many with tears in their eyes, deeply moved by Dwayne's words. As Dwayne prepared to wrap up the live stream, he turned to Jane one last time. Jane, remember what I told you yesterday. You are strong, you are brave, and you are not alone. And to anyone watching who might be facing bullying or feeling alone, the same goes for you. You've got this. And there are people out there who care about you and want to help. With those final words, Dwayne ended his lesson and the live stream. The classroom erupted in applause, students rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Before I go, he said, his voice carrying easily in the classroom, I want to make something very clear. His eyes swept across the faces of the teachers, his expression serious. What happened to Jane Harper was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one that exists in schools across the country. He looked directly at Mrs. Roselle, who stood at the back of the crowd, her face pale and drawn. What happened yesterday cannot happen again. Not to Jane, not to any student. I'm putting you all on notice. I will be watching. I will be checking in. And if I hear of any more incidents of bullying or discrimination in this school, I will be back. And next time, I won't be so nice about it. The teachers shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Dwayne's words settling heavily on their shoulders. A murmur of agreement rippled through the classroom. Dwayne nodded approvingly, then turned to Jane, who had been standing quietly. Jane, he said, kneeling down to her eye level, I want you to know how proud I am of you. It takes a lot of courage to stand up and share your story. You've made a real difference, not just for yourself, but for every kid in this school. As the applause in the classroom died down, a commotion could be heard from outside the school. Dwayne, the Harpers, and Principal Haraway moved to the window to see what was happening. To their astonishment, a small crowd had gathered at the school gates. Local news vans were parked haphazardly along the street, their satellite dishes extended skyward. Reporters clutched microphones, jockeying for position as they tried to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside the school. Looks like word got out, Dwayne said with a wry smile. He turned to Principal Haraway, whose face had gone pale at the sight of the media frenzy. I think it's time we addressed this situation publicly, don't you? Principal Haraway nodded weakly, tugging at his collar. Yes, I suppose we should. As they made their way through the school corridors towards the main entrance, students and teachers alike poured out of classrooms, creating an impromptu audience. The excitement in the air was palpable, a mix of celebrity awe and anticipation for what was to come. When they reached the school gates, the crowd outside erupted in cheers and camera flashes. Dwayne raised a hand, somehow managing to quiet the clamor with just that simple gesture. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice carrying easily over the assembled crowd. I'm here today because of a brave young girl named Jane Harper, and because of an issue that affects far too many of our children, bullying. He went on to explain the events that had brought him to the school, careful not to name Mrs. Roselle directly, but making it clear that the incident involved a teacher. As he spoke, the reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and camera operators zoomed in for close-ups. But this isn't just about one incident or one school, Dwayne continued. This is about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed in schools across the country. That's why I'm pleased to announce that Principal Haraway has committed to implementing comprehensive reforms here at Westfield Middle School. At this, all eyes turned to Principal Haraway, who stepped forward, looking nervous but determined. Yes, that's correct, he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. In light of recent events, we will be making several changes to ensure that our school is a safe and inclusive environment for all students. Principal Haraway took a deep breath before continuing. First and foremost, there will be immediate disciplinary action for the teacher involved in yesterday's incident, pending a full investigation. We will also be conducting a complete review and overhaul of our anti-bullying program, with input from students, parents, and experts in the field. He paused, making eye contact with various members of the crowd before continuing. We're establishing a dedicated anti-bullying department within the school, staffed by trained professionals. Additionally, we'll be integrating child psychology services to provide support for both victims and perpetrators of bullying. As Principal Haraway spoke, the crowd listened intently. Reporters' hands shot up, eager to ask questions, but Dwayne stepped in once more. "These reforms are a great start," he said, "but they're just the beginning. It's up to all of us, students, teachers, parents, and community members, to create a culture where bullying is not tolerated and where kindness and respect are the norm." He turned to Jane, who had been standing quietly with her parents throughout the impromptu press conference. "Jane, would you like to say something?" Jane hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her voice small but steady. "I just want to say, don't be afraid to speak up if you're being bullied, and if you see someone else being bullied, please don't stay silent. We all need to look out for each other." A ripple of applause went through the crowd at Jane's words. Dwayne placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, beaming with pride. As the press conference wound down, teachers who had gathered in the hallway began to approach Dwayne and the Harpers. Many expressed their support for Jane and their commitment to creating a more inclusive classroom environment. The day concluded with a symbolic photograph of Dwayne and Jane together, surrounded by students, teachers, and parents. The image captured more than just a celebrity visit. It represented a turning point, a moment when one girl's pain had sparked a movement for change. As the Harpers prepared to leave, Dwayne pulled them aside for a private word. "Remember," he said, his voice low and sincere, "this is just the beginning. There might be challenges ahead, but you've started something important here, and I'll be keeping an eye on things, making sure the school follows through on their promises. Let's continue this discussion online." With final hugs and words of encouragement, Dwayne raised a hand in farewell, then turned to walk out of the school. As he drove away, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy of the day lingered in the air. Something had shifted, not just in this school, but in the wider community. A conversation had been started, one that would continue long after the excitement of the day had faded. For Jane, walking back into school would still require courage, but now she walked with her head held high, knowing that she had the support of not just her family and Dwayne Johnson, but of an entire community ready to stand against bullying. As the crowd dispersed, Jane looked up at her parents, a small smile playing on her lips. For the first time since they'd moved to this new school, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead. But something had shifted today in her, in the school, and in the community at large.